there, church family. Take it away, Jake.
How's it going, Calvary? Welcome back to the Midweek Podcast. Listen, this is only your second podcast ever. You're going to get there. You're going to be able to handle the intro all on your own soon.
It's my second episode, and I think I know everything that there is to know about podcasting and the internets.
It's going to be fine. He's going to do great. You did great last week.
Oh, thank you.
How do you feel this week?
Good. I'm excited to talk Bible, Jesus and pals, and all that stuff.
Sounds great. Well, this podcast, like we mentioned last week, is to supplement the Vision series, Church for All Seasons, that's happening here at Calvary on Sunday mornings. Have any of you ever heard of the word Oikos? Well, I certainly hadn't until Anthony preached about it. That's not true. I probably heard about it at some point before that. But find your Oikos. That was the title of your message dealing with the entire idea of using our sphere of influence to glorify God and to further the kingdom. Why don't you talk a little about it?
Oikos is a word that is basically translated household. And so when we look at the account specifically in Acts of what we were talking about, Paul is in Philippi. Lydia gets saved. There's a demon-possessed girl that gets delivered. And then there's a Roman centurion that gets saved. And the centurion and Lydia, at the end of each passage, it says, and their household got saved.
Right.
And so the idea of household is not just necessarily a household like a husband, a wife, a father, mother, kids, the dog, whatever, right? It's taking the idea that a household is also your sphere of influence, because back then they would have had probably slaves, they would have had workers, they would have had people within this household that would have been interacting with them. So find your oikos was an idea of encouraging people, of not just like going out and preaching the gospel to like your family or any of those individuals. It's asking the question, who is my oikos? Who is my sphere of influence, and how can you have an impact there?
Right. I think it's also pointing to the fact that in order to have an impact for the gospel, you don't have to sell everything and move to China.
Right.
Do that if God tells you to do that. That can be your sphere of influence if that's what God wants it to be. But you don't have to go to crazy physical lengths to be a missionary like that, to have that impact on people. You don't have to. It just matters where God has you. And I think we've talked about this before here at church, that when Jesus gave the Great Commission, when he said, go therefore and make disciples, the Greek gives the idea of as you go, as you are living your life, as you're amongst your sphere of influence, you're making disciples from those people.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And it was a cool passage because even like right out the gate, it is all over the map in the respect that Paul gets a change of course. He literally is going in one place and then all of a sudden has a vision and says, hey, you have to go here now. He's like, all right. So he took this step of faith. And even again with oikos, sometimes having an impact on people, your loved ones, whoever, it is taking a step of faith. It is being in tune with the Lord, being in tune with the Spirit, and actually trusting in that. And so...
because you don't know how it's going to go.
Right. And again, we have 3 stories that it goes in completely different directions. Which story or whatever in this whole thing did you enjoy the most?
I think for me, it's the centurion because of the way that his story ends. So like Lydia's story ends with her whole household getting saved and getting baptized. And that's just kind of where that story leaves off. It ends on a high note. The slave girl's story ends in her bosses being mad that she's no longer as useful to them as she used to be. So hers ends badly. But then the centurion's story, the earthquake happens and he comes in thinking that all of the prisoners have escaped. So he's going to kill himself because of the shame, because of all of the repercussions of that culturally and socially. And then Paul says, hey, don't kill yourself. We're all still here. And then they talk and he gets saved and he goes and his whole household gets saved and gets baptized. But what I loved the most, and I was thinking about this when you were talking on that Sunday, that after they all get saved, they take the prisoners up to their house.
Right.
They take them out of the prison. The thing that he was afraid happened, he does. He takes them out of the prison up to his house and takes care of them and feeds them and, most likely, takes care of the injuries that he might have been one of the ones causing,
Right.
And so it's like he was going to kill himself because he was worried about the repercussions of what was going to happen. But then suddenly after getting to know Paul and getting to know Jesus, it's almost like those repercussions became, the possibility of those repercussions became worth it to him and his entire family. I just thought that was fascinating because I'd never really thought about that before. I'd never really noticed. So you have a story that ends good, one that ends bad, one that ends good but could potentially go bad later. Depending on bad relatively speaking, just, as we would look at it.
And I think for me, the thing that I like about all these stories is the demon-possessed girl.
Mm-hmm.
And, I made it very clear that she's not saved. She's delivered from her spiritual and human confinements of her chains, if you want to call it that. Mm-hmm. And what I like about this story is I think too much we, the church, tend to just elaborate on how good everything is. And sometimes being a Christian, things don't go the way you want. Yeah. Sometimes there is a risk that there is death. There is a risk that you might offend people. There's risks all the time. Yeah. And, what I like about this story is that it's real. It's real, and it's encouraging that, take that risk, guys. Find your oikos, but, don't think that everything's going to be fine and dandy and sour candy. Like what I did there?
I did.
But, and then also this woman is affected in such a way that it causes an uproar in the entire town.
Right.
And so, and even the good thing about that, even though she's not saved, it's causing a ripple effect. And I think we as Christians, we can do the same thing. We can have the same impact in our community. But and at times it starts off with, dare I say, failure. It starts off with not the way that you want it to go. And I think that's a really cool way to look about it, because that's been my story. That's been my sphere of influence, because my sphere of influence has changed. It changes like all the time.
I was like multiple times.
Whether it be working with these kinds of people, working in a kitchen, working groundskeeping, working at a church again in a different light. And so just being comfortable to, like I said the last time, or I might have said it during this message actually, is to not be rigid, but to be liquid. Don't be so stuck in what you want to do, but be liquid in the respect that, liquid changes with the things that happen, but it still goes out, it still goes forward.
Right. I appreciate that. Which sphere of influence that you've been a part of would you say was the most difficult to be a part of, or the most difficult to reach?
I think twofold. There's a lot of things. I think the people that is the most difficult for me has been oftentimes my attitude. It's only difficult because my attitude is in the wrong place.
Right.
And so for me, it oftentimes is Christians, actually, honestly, because more often than not, I have this attitude of they should know better. Why should I go tell them this? But at the same time, I've realized just recently that it's not just the world that needs the gospel. Christians need the gospel too. Right. And so some of the most difficult people have been Christians, but more often than not, it's because of my attitude that I bring to the table. And I'm not looking at him the way that I think Christ would look at him in that situation. Yeah. And then other legitimately difficult people are, the usual, I just don't want to hear it. Whether it be work, depending on the job that I was doing, most people knew that I was a pastor or knew I was a Christian and all that. And so sometimes people would immediately out the gate just say, I don't want to hear about Jesus. I'm like, cool, I'm here to do a job, whatever.
Right.
And it's funny, it's those kinds of people that eventually ultimately open up. And so part of that is, again, my attitude. I'm not here to cause an uproar, but, be prepared when the uproar happens, I guess.
Yeah. And I mean, being an influence to the people around you it's going to look different to whoever it is. They're going to be people who are open and willing soon after you meet them, and there's going to be people who it's going to take a relationship, a time of getting to know them and actually becoming close-ish. I mean, you don't have to be best friends with somebody for them to open up to you, obviously, but just whatever that is, that's another thing you got to be prepared for. And it's that attitude that you're talking about. It's important to keep that, just being prepared for it whenever it happens.
Absolutely.
Yeah. For me, I think the most difficult sphere of influence I've ever been in was, I should say, shortly after I came back to Jesus in 2013, and I moved back here from college was that, or I guess 2014 is when that would have been, was all of the old friends that I had only been like away from for like 4 or 5 months at a time, friends from high school and stuff like that, who knew me as the jerk that I was at the end of high school that definitely didn't care about Jesus, was suddenly now, having been transformed and been, revitalized, revived, in Jesus. Going back to that, I think I mentioned this a little bit in last week's episode of the podcast, that a friend of mine kind of treated me like he didn't like it anymore. Like I was talking to him and he said, "Oh, well, you're a man of God now," and all this kind of stuff. And so my sphere of influence that I was used to, it was much more difficult to even just be around them, because people didn't want to be around me anymore, friends that I had been really, really close to. And so it was like, eventually that sphere of influence died away. So I would say that's been the most difficult one, because I will never know, I don't think, if any fruit came from any of those conversations. Because I was also trying to not hit anybody over the head with the gospel.
Right.
I did that to a friend of mine early in high school, where I just shoved it at her and didn't stop shoving it at her until I just made her mad. And I part of that can be attributed to certain ways of evangelism, I feel like, that I was taught, which was just go after them and leave them alone, which did nothing but hurt the situation. But it's like those people I wasn't able to really be around anymore, and so that sphere of influence just kind of died away after that. I don't know, it was really interesting.
Here's an interesting question regarding your sphere of influence. Is there a sphere of influence that you've wanted to have an impact on, but God clearly either shut the door or let you just make the mistake because you pried the door open, and then you realize, like, oh, I'm not supposed to be here?
I don't know. I don't feel like I've done anything quite that brazen. I'd like to say that I haven't done that. I can't really think of anything where that God has shut down. I don't think God has really shut down a whole heck of a lot for me when it comes to that. There's been times within my own family that I've been like trying to speak to them and trying to help them through the things that our family has gone through, and it just isn't working coming from me. It needs to come from somebody else. It needs to come from God to start with. But like, sometimes I feel like I'm too close to the thing. There's like, I don't know what the term is if you're like a detective and you get a case but you can't work it because it's like the victim or something like that. I don't remember what the term is for that. I haven't watched a cop show in a long time, but sometimes I feel like that, where it's like I'm too close to the situation to actually help.
I mean, my point of reference is Rescue Ranger, so I don't even know how that would apply in this situation. Sorry,
That's
jokes.
Good. Well, a sphere of influence that I would like to have more of, to be perfectly honest, just me personally, is the internet. I've enjoyed trying to be a little tiny wannabe YouTuber, and to be honest, part of wanting to grow that community has been so that I can be a Christian on the internet. That's right. Making content that people enjoy, but can also love people and create an environment that's like open to influence like that. It's hard because the internet's hard to break into,
right.
And it's a whole mess. But that would be one that I would desire. God hasn't, I don't think, shut that down. It's just working on it. It's just a work in progress.
Well, and that's an interesting point, because I was thinking about it as I was asking the question, right? A lot of that has to do, I think, with understanding and being okay with who God has made you to be, right? Because as I was asking the question, I thought, like, have I ever done that? I'm like, no. And then I'm like, no, I have. And that has a lot to do with, again, identity, who I think I am and what I want to be, but then not really acknowledging and trusting who God has made me to be. I think, the people I listen to, the people that I read are like crazy scholars and just these Bible giants and all that can dissect Greek and Hebrew words, which is what I love to do. Mm-hmm. And so for whatever reason, I thought that like, that's my sphere of influence, right? I'm going to go into this realm of just, talking with brainiacs and all that. And I think I tried to paint myself as one of those, and mm-hmm. I failed miserably and I flopped. Mm-hmm. And I think, part of the hard part is for me is coming to the conclusion that it's okay that I'm not what I want to be, but trusting who God has made me to be.
Yeah,
and I think part of that is your sphere of influence, and just trusting that God has put you in a place that all you got to do is be you, you know? I'm funny, but yeah, I can be serious. I can do these things. I make jokes.
Yeah.
I tend to avoid people as much as I can. And God uses that for his glory.
Yeah.
But again, I think there's the attitude, trusting who you are in Christ, but then also the willingness to just really take that step of faith, right?
Yeah.
And in those influences and just not being afraid, you know?
Yeah, and I can remember a story. This is my favorite story about me where I failed at a moment where God presented me with an opportunity to just talk to somebody in my sphere of influence. Because, our sphere of influence, we're talking about, and it sounds like it's just like the people that we know, the people that we're around a lot,
Right.
but it's also the guy who worked at Subway that one time that I went in there. And I was wearing a cross necklace, and he asked me, he said, "Oh, are you a Christian?" And I was like, yeah, I am. And he said, would you say like you're really religious? And so it was interesting that was the question. Like he was like ringing up my sandwich, and that was the question that he asked me. And in my head, I went, this is such a good opportunity. I get to say, no, I'm not religious, because it's not about a religion. It's about a relationship. Like I got so excited to say that and to like get to have that conversation. But what came out of my mouth was, no. And I didn't say anything else. And he just went, oh, okay. And then just like rang up my sandwich, and I paid and I left, and I went, what happened just now? So it was like, it wasn't that I was like afraid or anything, but just like my mind fell apart after getting so excited to get to say something. And then I did answer his question. No, I don't consider myself very religious, except that I didn't explain anything. I just looked him dead in the face and basically shut the conversation down. So that was definitely a moment that it did not go the way I would have wanted it to go. Has anything like that ever happened to you?
All the time. All the time. I think, yeah, it's when I think it mostly happened early on in my relationship. But at the same time, the more I look at it, part of me was just acknowledging, well, let me back up. I think it's listening to the Spirit and just trusting that he's speaking. There's been times that I've done it and forced my way into a situation. But, like I was thinking, I remember this one guy that worked at Starbucks in Littleton, Colorado. And I was helping a friend out, actually. He was staying with me, so I was buying him some food or whatever. He didn't want whatever McDonald's I bought him, so I had some extra cheeseburgers. So I go into Starbucks, and this guy was like, dude, cheeseburgers? I'm like, you want one? And he's like, yeah. So I gave him a cheeseburger, and in my head I was thinking, dude, I can start talking to this dude about Jesus, and it's all going to be because of cheeseburgers.
Which, listen, I feel like Jesus is very appreciative of that.
Absolutely. And
like
he can.
Loves that.
He can use cheeseburgers. And it's funny. I remember this guy, weeks go by. I don't like Starbucks coffee. I'll just say that. Sorry. But I would get these inklings of like, go to that Starbucks and get a coffee. And I'm like, oh, that's gross. And I would go and I would talk to the staff. And then this one particular guy, I remember one day I come in to get a coffee, and he goes, I'm going to go on break. I said, okay. And he goes, I want to buy you a cheeseburger. Oh. And I said, okay. And I'm getting all excited, like, oh, dang, this is it. This is the opportunity. I could, I'm thinking of all the Bible stories of great. I'm like, I'm going to tell him about Jesus. He's going to accept it. And I'm going to be telling stories maybe years down the road on a podcast about how this guy got saved because of a cheeseburger, right? And so we go to McDonald's. We were walking over to McDonald's, and he goes, so what do you do? And I'm like, oh, the stars are aligning. All of these things are happening. And I'm getting so excited. And I'm telling him, like, oh, I'm a pastor and I work with this. And he kind of looks at me and goes, oh, I have questions. And the more I thought just how excited I was that this guy's going to get saved, he didn't get saved. That's similar to the story of the demon-possessed girl. He doesn't get saved, but there's plenty of opportunities that I gave him the gospel. I helped him think about things, and we created this relationship, and nothing came of it. And I remember years later I was thinking, like, God, why would you allow me to go through that? Why would you allow me to get super excited about this, that, and the other, right? And it's looking back, it's not about failure. It's about, I think, being obedient to God in the situation that you find yourself. And maybe down the road, maybe I'm face to face with Jesus in heaven. That dude's up there, and he goes, it is about the cheeseburgers.
It is about the cheeseburgers.
So for me, I've come to the conclusion that it's okay. I don't get the glory because I think building this story up, I'm painting a picture of how obedient I was, how willing I was. But God's like, it's not about you in the situation or even the cheeseburger. Yeah. It's how this guy may or may not come to me. And the same thing with the story. She's delivered from her sin, but she's not necessarily saved. Yeah. If anything, she's probably got a lot worse down the road because she's now even more useless.
Right.
And who knows what would have happened to her after that. And I think, there's a fear. There's a fear of, because I'm not going to be used like the way I want to be, because I may cause more harm, I'm just not going to do anything. I'm not going to take that step of faith out. So, which, by the way, don't do that either.
Yeah, for real. Well, thanks, dude, for talking with me about this today. I really, really appreciate it. I think this whole idea of Oikos is just a really neat thing. I got to share it with the youth kids on the Wednesday after you taught that sermon, and they seemed to really enjoy it too. So I appreciate this. Yeah.
It's an important thing, especially with young people, any person, however old, young, whatever, is just that not only does your story matter, but the people that you're having an impact on actually matters too. Yeah. And it's not about what you say. It's about maybe at times what you don't say. It's about showing them love. Absolutely. It's about being willing to be used in that sphere of influence. So,
certainly. Yeah. Well, hopefully this gives you guys something else to chew on after the message, Find Your Oikos, that Anthony taught the other Sunday as of recording this episode. Thank you guys so much for being with us today. Thank you for watching. If you're watching on YouTube, leave us a comment. Tell us what you thought. Tell us what you're thinking about when it comes to all of these things. And if you're listening on any other platform, leave us a rating, leave us a like, follow this podcast to get notified whenever a new episode comes up. It's really exciting to get to be doing this again. But thank you. Closing thoughts? Anything else you want to say? You want to come back for a third episode?
Let's do it.
Oh, okay.
Find your Oikos.
I love it. We'll see you guys later.